Okay, the first thing I'm going to do, for the moment we're not really interested in the particles, so you can see they actually do slow down interactivity a little bit, so I'm going to bring up the particle view and I'm just going to turn off this source, which as you can see turns off all the particles which are associated with it. So there we go, we've turned off our particles for now. The next thing I'm going to do is, actually let's just unfreeze everything, and I'm going to texture the plinths and the teapot and the ground, the ball and the rope with a default material, so we have a very basic scene that we can light with. If I do a render now, you'll see that we end up with default render basically using just some lights which are projecting from the camera from a perspective camera. And it's not particularly interesting in terms of rendering. So let's go to a front view here, and let's create a spotlight, a target spot. I'll put that slightly off center here, so it's shining down onto the teapot. Let's move the source of the light over here a little bit, and in perspective view, let's move it again a little bit off center, otherwise it's going to be, the rope will cause some really nasty shadows as it passes through. So I'll just put that here. Okay, that's cool. And we'll zoom in on the teapot and just do a quick render of that again. Okay, you can see it's very, very bright at the moment, so the first thing I'm going to do is actually just tweak the brightness values of that light. We'll just put that down to 1, only a 1. In this case I'm going to go for a kind of cool blue light, so I'll just reduce the saturation on that a little bit so it's only slightly blue. There we go. And I'm going to turn on shadows and change that to shadow maps. There we go. And I'm going to go to the shadow map parameters. Let's just make this into 2 columns here. I'm going to go to shadow map parameters, and let's just make the shadow map a little bit more detailed, and do a test render of that again. Okay, now you can see we've made it a lot darker, and you can see now that the teapot has got shadows being cast, and you can see that the plinth is casting shadows on itself on the floor and so forth. So it's starting to look a little bit more realistic, and it's also looking quite a bit more moody. Let's make a material for the floor. I'm going to go for a kind of Aztec theme here, so I'm going to create a material here called Aztec glyphs. There we go. And I'm going to create a bump map for that using a bitmap, and I'll just go to my maps here and my tutorial maps and pick up glyph. Just open that. There we go. You can actually view this image by pressing this button here, and you can see this is a sort of stylized group of 9 glyphs which I actually scanned in from some real Aztec archaeological sites, from a book of course, not actually from going to Mexico and scanning them there. I'm gonna, well actually let's do a quick render of that, see what we get out of it. Would help if I actually applied the material. I can apply the material to the selected object using this button. There we go. We'll do a render of that. Okay, you can see at the moment you're only seeing really one of the glyphs, and it's very, very large, so I'm going to increase the tiling on that bitmap by 2. So it tiles it twice, and it's looking a little bit better, but probably you could actually do with some, maybe a little bit more. There we go. So now we're getting some quite interesting detail on the floor. I'll just crank up the strength of the bump map there. Do a test render again. That's looking okay now, I think. Maybe a little bit more. Okay, yeah, that's looking quite cool. At the moment it's just using a diffuse grey for the colour, so I'm going to put something a little bit more interesting there. Maybe a little bit of noise. And I'm going to use 2 maps actually. I'll make them both a sort of beigey sandstone colour. There we go, that's quite cool. We'll just copy this colour to here, and maybe make it a little bit darker for some variety. Make it a fractal, and just bring the colours a little bit closer together here. if I click on that button there, you can see this a little bit more clearly what I'm doing. There we go. So that's quite nice. Make that a little bit smaller. This is a fractal texture, actually, the noise. There we go. So that looks a little bit more interesting in terms of looking like stone. I'll mix this together with a smaller version of itself. So I'll go to the mix map. I'll keep this map as part of the mix map. So there you go. It's actually kept the noise map in there. And I can actually drag this here and make a copy of it. And now this one will make quite a bit smaller. So it produces some fine detail. And we'll just mix that in with the other one. So there we go. We have something a little bit more interesting now. Okay, do a quick test render of that. And there you go. You can see the stone's a lot lighter. And because the actual light from above is predominantly blue, you can't really see that much of the beige color that I put into it. So, but you can see there is a little bit of variation in the brightness. So let's actually create a little bit more variation there. We'll effectively crank up the contrast a little bit. So there we go. And if I do a render again, yeah, you can see now there's a little bit more detail there. So that's looking quite a bit more interesting now. The next thing I'm going to do is do the same thing for, well, actually, the next thing I'm going to do is add a light source to our flaming ball here, to make that look, you know, it'll look a bit strange if the ball's on fire and it's got flame coming off it, and it swings through the scene, but it doesn't actually cast any light. So let's create a nice light source for that. In this case, I'm going to use an Omni light. There we go. I'll rename this to Fireball. There we go. And let's do a bit of naming here actually on quite a few objects. It's very useful actually. It's a very good discipline to get into, to actually name your objects when you're working on a scene, because there's nothing worse than getting a scene from somebody else, even if they've been in a rush, and they've not actually bothered to rename any of their objects, and you basically just get a bunch of objects called, box 1, box 2, box 3, which is pretty irritating, and it doesn't really give you any information about what you're actually really looking at. So it's actually quite vital really to actually do that. Here's a good example. Cylinder really should be called rope, shouldn't it? Geosphere, let's call it fiery ball. There we go. And another thing that you can actually do is to, if you look in the lister here, when we turn on all, you can see you've got a bunch of objects and they're in no real order, and without knowing more about Max or the scene, you may not really know exactly what each type of object is. So it can also be a bit of an idea to give things a prefix as well. So in this case, we've got a teapot here. Let's call this, this is a prop, so we'll give it a prefix of PRP. There we go. These plinths are also props, so we'll call those PRPs as well. Let's do the same thing for this shattered plinth here. Same here. Okay, the ground plane is part of the set, so we'll call that set. And you can see I'm using a 3-letter prefix, which basically is enough usually to give you an idea of what the object is, whilst not making the actual prefix into something a little bit too long-winded. So let's just rename these. These are also props. Plinth detail. We'll give that a number, and we'll copy that and we'll put that onto the other plinth details. Just increase the number each time. There we go. Oops. It's also quite useful, quite a nice way of working is to actually work on a scene like this, and get to a certain point and then say, okay, I'm going to hand this on to somebody else now, and use some renaming tools to actually batch rename a large number of objects. You can see what the result is now of using this prefix. You can see that all the props are listed together in the list here. You can see the rope actually is a prop as well, so let's just select